Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with hosts Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please look us up on your favorite podcast app, subscribe, like, and share so that you never miss an episode. If you'd like to further support us, visit patreon.com/speakingout and check out the different rewards. You'll find exclusive rewards if you sign up as a patron of the podcast. Thank you for your support, and let's get into the show. Welcome to this week's podcast. We thank our patrons, as always, for making this podcast possible. Could not do this podcast without our patrons. And we're going to plug our newest tier that we just added. You can go to patreon.com/speakingout. And we just added a new tier that is a once-a-month Zoom with us, where we talk about all things related to my book, the memoir that details our story, all the church issues that we faced, and your perspective as the wife, former wife, I should say, of an abuser, and all the ramifications that come with that.
Exactly, and we will disclose information and topics that we've not disclosed anywhere else.
Absolutely.
So we urge you, if this is of interest to you, to check out that newest tier and become one of our members there.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Okay, so in the news right now, there is a former truck driver, Rogel Aguilera-Mederos, who was just sentenced to 110 years in prison for an accident that happened in 2019 out in right outside of Denver on Interstate 70. I am a former truck driver, so I drove on and off for 10 years of my life. I've logged well over 1 million miles. I would say probably over 500,000 of those miles was behind the wheel of a tractor trailer. I have a lot of experience driving, and so this story definitely got my attention, and Rogel has the support of the trucking industry. There's a petition right now for clemency that is the fastest growing petition I think that's ever been on change.org, and it may surpass the most signed petition. As of right now, as of this morning, it was 4.5 million people had signed this petition, and that number just keeps going up, by the second. So, clearly this resonated with a lot of people. A lot of people definitely fall on the side of thinking that this sentence was too harsh.
Oh my. Yeah.
So I'm going to give kind of an overview and then talk about key points, and then we're going to talk about kind of the opposite end of that spectrum, where sex abuse charges are minimal, and the sentencing guidelines for sex crimes in this country is absolutely far less than vehicular homicide.
I think at the end of this particular podcast, you'll see the absurdity of how our laws operate.
Yeah.
And absurd, and the fact that we do need change within our legal system.
Yes.
So I don't want to belabor that, Jimmy. If you want to
Yeah.
explain, I think as Jimmy explains from a truck driver's view, what he sees about Rogel, I think it lays the foundation for when we talk about the sex abuse crimes and the criminal system and how it deals with those.
Yeah. So what's interesting is I've not seen any truck drivers talk about what happened in the cab of that truck, which is really fascinating to me, because all of us truck drivers know kind of what was going through his mind and what was happening in real time. We can basically recreate that accident pretty easily. So I'm just going to give a quick overview. Okay, so assuming a lot of you don't have experience behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler. Rogel was a 23-year-old at the time, 23 years old, a Cuban immigrant, which is young. You have to be 21 years of age in the United States to travel cross country. To leave your state of license, you have to be 21 years of age. Until you're 21, you cannot leave your state's line in a commercial vehicle. He was hired at a small company in Houston. They only had 5 trucks. So his truck was one of 5. This was his first solo trip that he ever took. All the other trips that he took were, he was part of a convoy. So he was on his own. He was inexperienced in mountain driving. And let me tell you, mountain driving is a very different animal. And I am familiar with Lookout Mountain, where Rogel crashed. And that descent coming into Denver, you drop 6,000 feet in a matter of 6 miles. It's like a 6% grade. And this is a very, very scary hill. On Interstate 70, heading eastbound. This is a really critical descent, and this is like expert level mountain. Seriously. We also know that 40 minutes before the crash, he called his boss from Berthoud Pass to report some kind of a brake issue. Here's a quote from his testimony. He said, "When I checked the brakes in the pass, I explained what the brakes looked like to Raphael," that's his boss, because he had more experience. So clearly there was some kind of an issue going on before. I'll explain in a second what I believe was going on, which is a really common problem with brakes on tractor trailers. I think quite simply his brakes were out of adjustment, which is incredibly dangerous and incredibly common. Another point, he missed a runaway truck ramp, barreling down Lookout Mountain at 85 miles per hour. There's video footage of somebody taking a cell phone footage of him flying down, blown past this emergency truck ramp, runaway truck ramp, and he passes right by it and just keeps going. So, of course, the prosecution said he had multiple opportunities to get his truck stopped, including that runaway truck ramp.
Now, why was he going at that speed, Jimmy?
He had a runaway truck.
Right.
So,
okay. Well, I wanted you to clarify that. It wasn't just that he was sitting there cruising along at 85.
No.
Right.
His truck was completely out of control.
Okay.
And I'll explain how that happens.
Right.
I actually had that happen to me. And, when I was a new driver, I had it happen, and this very easily could have been me. I got lucky. Rogel didn't. And then the final point, he hit stop traffic at the bottom, instantly killing 4. He injured 10. And this was a 28 vehicle accident, fiery accident. So what happens is, a couple key points. Again, like I mentioned, Lookout Mountain is a 6,000 foot descent into Denver. It's a very, very dangerous descent. Several truck companies do not allow first-year drivers to run this mountain. Basically, it's the equivalent of sending a brand new skier who learned on the bunny slope, taking them up the lift and putting them down a double black diamond ski slope. You don't do that.
Right. Exactly.
It's a recipe for disaster. I mean, it's just common sense says you don't do that. He was not trained to descend this mountain, not this kind of a mountain. He's also from Flat, Texas. He was from Houston, where they don't have mountains. He was not experienced in mountain driving, and it was a recipe for disaster from the very beginning. Most drivers are not trained on mountain driving or how to properly adjust brakes. This is a critical point. I'm going to talk about brakes here for a second because this is, I think, a key point in this accident. He's experiencing brake problems, some kind of a brake problem. He didn't know what it was. He just knew his brakes weren't really responsive. I also sold truck parts for over a year, so I understand a lot of the mechanics behind trucking. But what a lot of trucks are doing now, a lot of trucking companies now, because their trucks are over the road, they're moving to, almost every truck now has automatic slack adjusters for the brakes. So auto slack adjusters are different from manual in that they have a ratcheting system inside of them. So the brakes are supposed to, in theory, ratchet up. As your brake shoes get lower, your brake takes up the slack, and then it always keeps the brake pad right up against the brake drum, so that when you press the brake, it's right there against the drum, and it's very responsive. There's no slack in it. That's why they're called slack adjusters. The problem is, these things are total crap. I mean, they really are. I know of many trucking companies that I sold truck parts for that they would take off every automatic slack adjuster and replace them with manual slack adjusters.
Okay.
Because if you don't grease them at the right time, and if you don't train the driver on how to properly adjust them, they're always going to be out of adjustment. Always, 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 always. According to DOT, if you have 20% of your brakes out of adjustment, that's considered, it's a red tag where they shut you down. They literally will inspect your truck, tag it, and they'll shut you down until you get your brakes properly adjusted.
As you're talking here, by the way, my mind is racing to when you did drive truck and when your brother did, how I used to worry about all of these things because you boys would explain
We did a
to
lot of
me
mountain driving
about
too.
that you did. And it also reinforces to me that truck drivers are not just bodies behind a wheel. They're behind a lethal weapon, so to speak. They know it. It's a tense job. They can never not focus on that, on what they're doing, and they have to inspect that vehicle, that
Absolutely.
big rig themselves before each trip. And all of this, in essence, is making a lead in to where we're going with our sex abuse case here.
Yeah.
As we hear this, I mean, there are so many points that are relevant. So thank you, Jimmy.
Yeah. So on these auto slacks, if you have a brake that's out of adjustment, you're supposed to do you're required to do a pre-trip inspection every time you take a brake. You take your required DOT brake, and then you start the truck back up. You're required to do an entire pre-trip inspection. That includes a brake test that tests the travel of each brake. So on a tractor trailer, you have 5 axles. You have your steer axle on the tractor. Then you have your 2 tandems, your tandem axles on the tractor. Then you have tandem axles on the trailer. So that's a total of 5 axles.
Right.
The axles that do the braking are the 4 from the tandems. So your steers basically we always joked instead they're there for looks.
Right.
They really don't do any of your braking hardly at all. So you have 1 on each side on each axle, so you have a total of 8 brakes that are doing the braking. That's not a lot of brake shoes
No,
that
it's
are
not.
touching the
No.
drums.
Not at all.
For 80,000 pounds. By the
Right.
way, Rogel would have been 80,000 pounds. That's the maximum gross weight. He was hauling lumber, very heavy. He would have been maxed out at anywhere from 78,000 to 80,000 pounds. That's a lot of truck for going down that steep of an incline.
And that's another thing that we need to remember when he started that descent. All that weight just pushes the
And
speed.
gravity does its job,
Right.
and
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
you have a runaway truck
Right.
really quickly. So I was not properly trained, and I went to a trucking school for a very big company. I had very good trainers. They told us how to properly inspect our brakes. They never showed us how to
Right.
do it.
Big
so
difference.
when you hear terms like you have a Type 30 maxi chamber and you're supposed to check the rod for a maximum of 1 3/4 inch travel on a manual slack adjuster, and a maximum of 2 inches of travel on an automatic slack adjuster, what's going through your mind right now?
Yeah,
Right?
exactly.
Unless I crawl underneath the truck and I
Yeah.
show you, I'm speaking a different language.
Foreign
to you.
language, yes, absolutely.
We were never shown how to do it. We were told how to do it. I was never personally shown. I think that's probably commonplace. So one of the most critical components of the truck, which is your brakes, we're not even taught how to properly inspect them. That's a huge no-no. So on these auto slack adjusters, the way that you adjust them is you do it's called a 6-pack. And so you punch the brakes really hard 3 times. Boom, boom, as hard as you can hit that pedal, which seems unnatural because you're like, okay, am I going to break something?
Yeah.
You literally plow that brake pedal as hard and fast as you can 3 times, and then you build your air back up, and then you give it 3 more punches for a total of 6. And then you're supposed to put the truck in reverse, and you start backing up, and then you give it 1 hard stab. And then you crawl underneath and you do your whole pre-trip inspection and you test the amount of travel again. It's a really complicated process, and people are not trained how to do it. Clearly, Rogel was not trained how to do
Right.
it, which is probably the vast majority of drivers who are out there. So it made sense to me that he was having issues with his brakes to begin with. He knew that, but it wasn't severe enough that he was like, well, they're inoperable, because they were operable.
Right.
Okay. So he gets to the top of this hill, and this is where I messed up when I was a rookie driver. I was on 470, which goes around Wheeling, West Virginia, and there's about a 6% descent when you get back onto Interstate 70 for about, I don't know, probably a mile and a half, maybe 2 miles. Very steep hill, very dangerous hill. I started down the hill in ninth gear. It was a 10-speed transmission, manual transmission. I'll talk about that in a second too. But I started my descent in ninth gear. I found out, as soon as I started that descent, I knew right away I was in the wrong gear.
Scary stuff. Yeah.
You cannot change gears once you start your descent. These have what's called an unsynchronized transmission, which means when you shift gears on a manual transmission, you have to rev your engine when you downshift, and you have to match the engine's RPMs to the same speed that your transmission is traveling for that gear. So if you're already descending, your brakes alone are not going to hold you back, period. So you have to match the gear. If you get your RPMs off by even 100 RPMs, you're done. It will not go into gear. You can't force it. It'll sit there. It'll grind. You cannot put that thing into gear. So he was stuck in whatever gear he started in.
Right.
He was stuck in that gear.
Poor guy.
One gear too high is the difference between a controlled descent and an out-of-control descent, like what Rogel experienced.
Wow.
What happened to me is I got my brakes hot. I knew I was going to get my brakes hot, and I knew we had been told about this. I had never experienced it, but it's called brake fade. Brake fade is classified as brake failure. Now, for people who are not commercial driver license holders, you hear brake failure and you think, oh, well, the brakes, something mechanical happened, your brakes failed. They will no longer work. That's not the case. What happens is you get that steel drum hot. The brake shoes have to press against the steel drum, and because of friction and all the heat that's produced, you get that steel drum glowing red hot. Metal expands when it's hot. So you're actually increasing the distance of travel that your brake shoes have to travel to meet that drum to create friction. If your brakes are out of adjustment even by a 1/16 of an inch,
which that's such a tiny.
Imagine what's going to happen.
Oh yeah. Oh my. Yeah.
And then you have your brake drum swell to where now you've created heat, which reduces the amount of friction. Plus you've created distance between the shoe and the drum. You have what's classified as brake failure. Your brakes do not work, period. So now you have what's classified as a runaway truck. It's an out-of-control vehicle. So this is exactly where he found himself pretty shortly into a 6-mile descent at a 6% grade, 5-6% grade. That is massive. You're gonna get up to.
That's a steep grade, and it's a long descent.
And it's 80,000 pounds pushing you down that hill.
Right.
So this is exactly what happened to him. Being a good operator. I'm going to talk about this for a second because I think this is really important. So being a good operator requires a combination of experience, common sense, and proper training. Rogel lacked all three of those. He had absolutely no experience in mountain driving whatsoever. He lacked common sense. That's not to say that he's dumb. I don't believe that at all, not for a second. But common sense comes a lot of times from experience.
Experience and education.
And training, right?
Yes,
it's a combination.
right.
All of those have to work in tandem.
Right. In order for us to use common sense, we have to have some kind of training, some kind of education to teach us. That common sense is different from a gut feeling.
Right.
I think
gut
Rogel
feelings
had
do
a
you
gut
very little
feeling.
good.
He had a gut feeling when he called in and said something's wrong with these brakes. Common sense didn't kick in yet because he wasn't trained as to what to do when he had that gut
Yes.
feeling.
So common sense combined with training
Yeah.
would say, okay, I need to be very inconvenienced because,
Right.
again, experience and common sense tell you, and training, that I have a 6-mile descent at 6% grade. I'm telling you guys, this mountain is scary. And I'm saying that as a very experienced driver. It is a scary mountain. In a truck, you're sitting really high, so you're looking down over. And when you're coming down Lookout Mountain, I kid you not, when you're making that descent to Denver, you'll see tractor trailers. We call it a graveyard. There's a graveyard of tractor trailers that careened off the guardrail and went down over the cliff, and there's no way to recover them. And
Wow.
so Rogel was looking at those.
frightening.
He was looking at that graveyard of tractor trailers as his truck is out of control. Common sense and experience would have said, inconvenience yourself, call a mechanic, get him out to inspect your brakes and find out what's going on before you make this descent. His boss said, well,
Let me know.
based on what you're telling me, everything looks fine. You'll be all right. He was not all right. For a whole host of reasons. Basically, it was a recipe from disaster.
Neither
a recipe
were
of
the
disaster.
innocent bystanders at the
Exactly
end of
right.
at the bottom of that mountain.
Exactly right.
Right.
So, what happens is you panic in those moments, and if you panic, your ability to make rational decisions, it's basically non-existent. So
Right.
that combined with not having a pool of experience and information from training, he literally didn't know what to do. It's like an airplane that's out of control, but you're the co-pilot who had very minimal training, and your captain is left the cockpit.
Right.
Like you don't have a pool of experience or knowledge to figure out, okay, how do I get out of it? It's not a Captain Sully Sullenberger.
And he was solo, which means that's frightening in and of itself. First solo trip.
Right.
First solo.
Yeah. So everything about this was scary to him. He completely panicked, which takes away your ability to make rash decisions, to make wise decisions, rather. So, people are like, the prosecutors were like, well, how did you pass this runaway ramp? And like the signs were clear and you didn't go down the runaway ramp.
Stop, yeah.
He said under oath that he saw the first 2 signs for the runaway ramp, but he missed the last 2 signs. And I believe it wholeheartedly. I've been in panicked situations.
Yeah.
I believe wholeheartedly he didn't see it. I don't think he's lying about that.
Can you imagine how he was gripping everything?
He said his hands were numb because he was gripping the wheel so tight.
I keep thinking how tensed up he must have been. He wasn't looking for signs. He was trying to keep that rig from toppling over the ledge where into the graveyard there.
Yep. So what happened is he starts making a bunch of really bad decisions. Because of the panic, he's now making a horrible situation even worse. He tried to set the parking brakes. So on a tractor trailer, you have 2 different knobs. They pull out, they're spring loaded, and you have one for your tractor brakes and one for your trailer brakes. He pulled both of those knobs out, thinking, well, I'll pull these parking brakes to try to get some more slowing going on. Well, those parking brakes, one, are not meant for stopping a moving truck. They're meant to hold a parked truck in place. But secondly, he has no brakes because of brake fade. So they don't do any good anyway. He may as well stick his hand out the window and try to slow the truck down by air rushing across his hand. It's not going to happen. So he sets the parking brakes, and he said at the time of the accident he was in neutral. And a lot of people think about that and are like, well, why would he be in neutral? I didn't hear the testimony, so I didn't hear him explain why, but I know as a truck driver why he was in neutral. He was trying to find a gear. He was he was trying everything he could to get that thing slowed down. And at 85 miles an hour, I'm telling you, there is even the high gear that he was in, he's not going back into that gear. You're done. Once you go to neutral at that speed, you're cooked. You're done. Now you have a truck that I didn't talk about Jake brakes. So Jake brakes, also called an engine retarder, it puts compressed air into your pistons, and you have a 3-stage Jake brake on a tractor trailer. So Stage 1 pumps air into two cylinders, and it creates resistance against that piston. So it's making your engine work hard. So when you're going down a hill, your engine is actually holding your truck back. Stage 2 goes from 2 cylinders to 4, and a stage 3 is all 6 cylinders. So stage 3 is the maximum. He would have been stage 3 on his Jake brake. Once he put that thing in neutral, he had 0 engine holding him back and 0 brakes. He had nothing. He truly was a runaway at that point, 100% runaway. So the prosecution argued that he had lots of options to avoid the accident. They said that he knew that there were mechanical issues before his descent. That's true. But his lack of training, lack of experience, and lack of common sense, and his boss telling him to get back in the truck, all contributed to this accident. As I mentioned, he passed a runaway truck ramp, and the prosecution said, well, you know, it was there and you didn't use it. And they even asked him, did you know that you should have used a runaway truck ramp?
Well, sure,
and he said,
knew.
yes.
Yeah, I know. Of course he did.
But he literally didn't see it. Another experienced driver who took a reporter out said he could have stopped or at least slowed on the uphill parts of the pass. It's not all downhill. There are a couple places where it levels out and goes uphill a little bit. I think his brake fade probably didn't get really bad until that last descent, which in my opinion is the most dangerous. It's the steepest and most dangerous, and the most critical. And by that point, his brakes were already hot. And
Having
he was
been
done.
in vehicles, we live in the mountains here, and we've experienced some crazy experiences driving out of control when we hit ice. And at that point, there's no brakes. I mean, no sense
I'm telling
in
you,
trying.
ice is nothing compared to a runaway
well, that's
truck.
what I was going to say.
I've experienced both.
That is probably mild compared to what this young man
It's
was
terrifying.
experiencing. And I know I've whipped past stop signs and right through red lights and whatnot. When you are gliding on ice, you could be asked, didn't you see that? Sure, I saw it. I couldn't stop.
Yeah.
And that's what's
Yeah.
going on with him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, another key point, and again, experience, common sense, training somewhat, this is more common sense and experience, says he could have done what I call truck flop. He could have flopped a truck on its side. And what happens is it's basically a controlled crash. So tractor trailers are extremely, it's like to use a really weird analogy, it's like a big fat person on top of 2 little ice skates. Like you're real wobbly,
Right.
and it's very top heavy. You're very heavy. You're on these little wheels, and it's really easy to set one of those over. It's so easy to tip one over. He could have found a place where there was no traffic, and what I would have done if there was no truck ramp around, and if I had a few years experience.
I was just going
Not
to
as a new
say,
driver, I wouldn't
yeah,
have done it.
No.
But with experience, you think about these things, and you're like, okay, how do I minimize casualties, or have 0 casualties? Like 0 casualty is what you want. So at that point, you don't care about the equipment. They make new trucks every day. So flop over is where you steer the truck one way, and then real quick snap it back the other way to intentionally flop the truck onto its side. Going down the mountain, even at 85 miles an hour, that creates so much friction underneath it that truck is going to slide, and eventually it's going to come to a stop. It's basically an uncontrolled stop based on friction.
Right.
And what you want to do naturally is to flop it to the passenger side. You flop it to the driver's side, you could
Well, the driver could be
get
killed.
injured
Yeah,
or
right.
killed.
Yeah. Right.
So, he had a number of options that would have been available had he had training and experience. So my point is, this 110-year sentence, he had no drugs in his system. He had nothing on his record. Nothing. Absolutely 0. No alcohol, no drugs. The guy begged for forgiveness. He said, I wish that I would have died instead of those
And I'm
people.
sure he has wished that a million times
Yeah,
over.
the trauma that he lives with is absolutely horrific.
Right.
Now, I know people truck drivers who've killed people. I know quite a few of them, actually, in accidents similar to this. And they're not sitting in prison. A lot of them went driving the next day.
Right. What happened to him? What was he being made an example?
Everything that I see says yes. The district attorney or the assistant district attorney was actually at that scene, and
Okay.
she did something controversial. I saw an article about this, but there was a brake shoe from his truck, and she took a picture of it tagged and put this like big long tirade about. It was a really weird rant that she put on Facebook about how she's going to see that justice is served and like all this stuff, and I mean that was without hearing any of the evidence of what happened. She already had it in her mind that this guy was going to get crucified. Colorado has antiquated laws. They did away with the death penalty, so they increased the mandatory
Okay,
minimums.
Okay.
And so for the crime, which again, I'm not saying guilt or innocence. I think probably the jury got it right. Unfortunately for this young man, he is guilty of negligence. Certainly not intent, but definitely negligence. And the poor guy, that was from just horrific training, and the guy was doing everything he knew how to do, but he just wasn't ever trained properly.
So what happens when laws go crazy with sex offenders? We see a 110-year sentence here, and we see an untrained young man
Who had an accident.
who had an accident. Nothing was intentional. Nothing at all.
Nothing.
Nothing was intentional. But then we see crimes of rape, child molestation, child rape, and we see that number one, these cases go years often without even being heard. Number two, many
If they are at all.
if they are heard at all. Number two, many of them are just thrown out immediately because the police don't have time to investigate, or they don't want to investigate.
That's it.
Or they didn't collect the right information at the time of the rape, or they didn't want to bother themselves with collecting the right information at the time of the rape, or they've already formed an opinion that this was not a rape.
Or, which happens really often, you have bleeding heart judges.
Absolutely.
Who reach out to the offenders and give them light sentences, or let them off altogether. I want you to read a couple excerpts from this article because I think this really ties in to help us understand why there's so much outrage by so many millions of people for the sentencing on Rogel. And this article is called "Why Society Goes Easy on Rapists." This was published in Slate by Lily Loofborough, Loofborow, May 30th, 2019. I'll link to it in the description. But Why Society Goes Easy on Rapists. It's a 12-page article. I think phenomenal article. But I want you to read some of the excerpts from this, just to kind of
I'm going to
give
briefly
our listeners
just
an understanding.
skim through here. Sexual assault is massively underreported, which we know. And even when victims come forward, convictions are rare. According to RAINN, RAINN, and we know what that is, only 5 out of every 1,000 rapes committed, that's 0.5%, ends in a felony conviction. That's next to nothing. That's nil. The Washington Post puts the figure at 7 out of 1,000, but pretty much everyone agrees it's under 1%. We usually try to make sense of this painfully low number by noting that many rapes aren't reported, which is true, but the crime is also notoriously under investigated, and we know that's true. continue with one more little paragraph. And when it's investigated, it's pretty tough to prove, not because of the crime's high proof threshold, but because of how little evidence about it we bother to collect. And I think bother is a real key word there.
Yeah.
There is, for example, a national backlog of hundreds of thousands of untested rape kits. And behind that big number are stories that don't get told. Rather than heal or wash or even change after being attacked, these women went straight to the hospital where they had to undress, subject themselves to intrusive physical exams, and get interrogated. And then nothing happened. No one did anything with the evidence they offered at great personal cost. Actually, that's not true. According to a CNN investigation, 25 law enforcement agencies in 14 states were found to be destroying rape kits in cases that could still be prosecuted. This was a routine process, they said, done to make space in evidence rooms.
Can you imagine them doing that at the scene of this accident?
Yeah. No.
I mean,
no.
imagine the amount of money,
Right.
resources, time that was thrown at this accident. And I'm not saying it shouldn't have. I think it should
Right.
have been investigated. I think that probably given everything that happened, charges were appropriate. I don't know that the sentence was really appropriate. That's another podcast for another day. But, they stopped at nothing to investigate this accident.
Well, and you've brought that out, Jimmy, before with plane crashes. The same thing.
That's right.
Every tool is pulled out. Personnel, people from the high ranks down to the lowest are called out to get every shred of evidence. In rape cases, I glossed over what happens to a woman when she reports, but she's already been through the trauma of having her body invaded by an intruder, and whether this intruder is known or not. And that's another thing. When a rape takes place by someone who is known, there seems to be this thought that, well, you knew this person. You must have let it happen, or you must have led him to think he could do whatever.
Yeah.
But then to have to be undressed, to provide body specimens, to have your body poked and prodded, to go through the ordeal of telling immediately what happened is no small thing.
That's right.
I mean,
Yeah.
the trauma.
But then to have your rape kit thrown
And
out,
then,
I
right.
mean, that's the end result.
as if it's nothing. Yeah. Like,
Sorry, we can't investigate. Well, wait a second. This was an intentional act. Unlike this accident with
right.
Rogel,
Right.
these are intentional.
And
but-
the harm is every bit as bad, I would say, because a death is lasting. Obviously, these families will,
And traumatic. I
well,
mean, absolutely
right.
traumatic.
And a rape is certainly traumatic, and the results the results of a rape will last with a person forever.
Yes.
Forever. There is no end.
Well, we'll talk about, kind of close this up by talking about sentencing, because I think this is the heart of this issue right now. Here's this massive sentence, and the judge actually stopped short of apologizing. He said, if, given the circumstances, if given a choice, this is not the sentence that I would hand down to you.
Right.
But because of Colorado's mandatory minimums for the crimes that he was convicted of, he was found guilty of by the jury. The judge said, I have no choice but to give you 110 years. It's awful. So here this article says the Star Tribune found that provided they knew their victims, only about half of defendants convicted of felony sex assaults in Minnesota got any prison time at all.
Yep.
Judges were twice as likely to reduce a sentence when the attacker knew the victim, and in 227 separate cases, reduced the recommended sentences of men convicted of felony sex assault such that they spent less than a year behind bars. I mean, this is unbelievable. And then she says, if we translate these outcomes into judicial rankings of a crime's severity, judges are sending a pretty clear message. It's not as bad to rape someone you know. And then she talks about the bleeding heart judge syndrome. She said, then there's a judge who, in sentencing a man convicted of raping his 14-year-old student, remarked that the young girl, who had since died by suicide, was, quote, as much in control of the situation, end quote, as her teacher, and was, quote, older than her chronological age, end quote. He gave the guy back in court after violating a sweetheart deal in which all charges would have been dropped if, among other requirements, he'd completed a sex offender treatment program. He didn't. A mere, listen to this, 31 days.
Mm-hmm. It doesn't shock me anymore because you and I have seen this over and over and over again. The little slap on the wrist, basically saying, "You naughty little thing, don't get caught doing this again," and that's it. And there's not a clear, strong message being sent that this offense, this crime, will not be tolerated. That message is not being sent.
No.
And so where's the deterrent, really?
Well, I think that's the problem. We have a major issue with our judicial system, and we find, bleeding hearts for sex offenders all the time. It's not just in the church. Trust me. We see it in the court system routinely, where judges do things like this. There's Robert H. Richards, the fourth, the DuPont heir, who was convicted of raping his 3-year-old daughter. The judge suspended his 8-year sentence because he, quote, might not fare well, end quote, behind bars. He got no time in prison at all. This is not cases that are like the exception to the norm. This happens all the time. You have places like California that during COVID were releasing convicted serial sex offenders en masse to reduce COVID in the prisons. Well, thank God that the prisoner rapists aren't
Just
getting COVID.
Right.
Put them out on the streets.
I will never follow that reasoning ever.
But
never.
It's a really big issue, and I don't know necessarily what the answer is. I recommend, I'm going to put a link to it, but if you really want to understand what's going on in the trucking industry, there's a guy, Bonehead Truckers. This guy puts up videos of truckers doing dumb things, and he's hilarious. I mean, this guy is absolutely hilarious. But he did a thing on Rogel a couple days ago, and I thought it was really good. And he said, this is one that I can't bring myself to joke about.
Right.
But he's like, I put these videos up. He said, every day people send me these videos of truck drivers doing these stupid things. Like, I'm telling you guys, as a truck driver who spent a lot of time on the road, it is frightening. The quality of drivers has plunged. I mean, guys, it's scary. But it's plunged because there's such a desperation for drivers that
Right.
training has gone out the window. And so Bonehead Truckers, he said, what we really need is for these big companies who have the power to make change, they need to lead the way in training people exceptionally. Like, they need to pump money into it. They need to stop allowing somebody who has 3 months experience driving to be a trainer. Like, that's not okay.
Right. Don't you think also that the word truck driver carries with it kind of a stigma of lower class? You know what?
Yeah.
If
And
it
they're
was
not.
made
Yeah.
a professional position, which it is, in my opinion, and should be, and then train like professionals.
Yeah.
And the same goes for this. When I hear of a case of a father raping his 3-year-old daughter and he serves no jail time because, heaven forbid, jail.
He might not fare well
Right,
in
he
prison.
might not fare well in jail. Really, there needs to be different messages sent out. The wrong message is being sent out there. He had money. He had place in society, and because of that, he's let off. Now, there are some
That's right.
acts of that it drives me crazy based on what you look like. If you
Absolutely.
look
And,
like
and she brilliantly brings that out in the
right,
article. You know, if you're white, if you have money, if you
if
have
you're
power,
white, upper class, wear a
you're
suit,
way more likely to get off.
right, than you are if you are of
Absolutely.
different color, wearing shoddy clothes and whatnot. There's a perception of who rapes and who does dirty raping, so to speak. And the clean raping seems to get off the hook a lot better.
They're not even calling it that, though. They call it missteps,
know.
mistakes,
Yeah,
things like
right.
that.
And I think it's at the core of our judicial system as well as at the core of we need to do some better educating. A rape is a
Yes.
rape is a rape is a rape is a rape. And it deserves the punishment of a criminal,
Yeah.
not a slap on the wrist.
Well, I mean, to use the analogy again, I think these court cases with child sex offenders, especially child sex pedophiles, child sex abusers. I think that those cases, because of the magnitude of how sophisticated a lot of these pedophiles are, I think that those are the double black diamond cases that are handed to the judges, and I think there's no room at all for us to have a lack of training for judges, district attorneys, assistant district attorneys, prosecutors. Like, all of these guys have to be trained and trained well in how these guys think, how they operate, how they create their victims, because what they're seeing in court in the discovery package is a fraction of what actually went on in the lives of people. Just like I can crawl inside, I can instinctively get inside of the cab of Rogel's truck, and every other truck driver who's experienced is doing it. That's why there's such backlash within the trucking community, because we've all been there.
Right.
We all get it. We know it. We know what happened. Without ever seeing the evidence for this case, I can walk you through what happened as he went down that hill.
And I think you hit a key note, Jimmy, is our judges and our attorneys and our district attorneys need trained in what is involved in this mind that rapes children, that rapes anyone.
And our lawmakers need to be educated.
Well, that's
the ones
what I'm
who are making the laws.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's what I meant when I said it has to start at the core beginning. That's with education. It has to. We have to completely continue doing that job of educating.
Yeah.
And change will come about, but boy, it's a long overdue process.
Well, I hope that this case, this petition for clemency for Rogel, I hope that this isn't just about vehicular homicide. I hope that this is an opportunity to say, look, like our laws are really slanted. Our judicial system is really slanted, if anything, in favor of people who use and abuse other victims sexually. Like, it really is slanted in their favor. Mom and I were talking before the episode, and my dad received a hefty sentence of 30 years. And I'm not being sarcastic.
No, that
For
was
sex
that
crimes,
was about unheard of.
For sex crimes,
that was unheard of.
and keep in mind,
right.
he's been abusing little children, prepubescent children, his entire life.
Right. Yep.
And he got a hefty sentence of 30 years. Rogel, who was in this panicked, terrified state because of lack of training and experience and all these other things, because he was the one responsible for that vehicle, which was an accident. It genuinely was an accident. There's nothing intentional about what he did.
Yeah.
Because of that, he's serving 110-year mandatory minimum in prison. Something's not right, and we need to speak up.
You are correct
about
on that.
Both in the in industries like the trucking industry, all the way down to training people about how abuse works. We need better training, and it's got to start at the top.
I think it's critical, Jimmy. I really do. I think we are at a critical point now where we have people's attention on sex abuse. Now we have to do something about it. Get the right training out there, get the right people making laws, and let's do something about it now.
Absolutely. Well, we better wrap it up. We went
Yeah.
long, but this is one I'm very passionate about, and obviously, and I think that we need to be voices in our community when we see unfair sentences. I think we need to speak up and be like, something's not right here, and we got to start at least on the local level, saying,
Amen.
there's got to be better training in our judicial system.
Right.
All right. Well, thank you for tuning into this episode.
Thanks again for listening to today's episode. A special thank you to our patrons who make this podcast possible. Please help us get the word out by searching for the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast in your favorite podcast app. Be sure to hit subscribe and rate the show. Please consider supporting the podcast by becoming a patron and check out the rewards our patrons receive.